This is House Planning Help episode 130. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. My personal goal is still to create an energy efficient home, although the timescale looking iffy and looking to extend off into the horizon. I wanted to do it before I'm 40, which is this coming August. Today, my guest is Lisa Jackson from Jackson Planning, and we're going to be hearing the story behind her self-build. You might have realised from that introduction that she's in planning herself, so some good tips there. We also talk about contextual design, financing, and the fact that this project was never going to be a passive house, but at some point in the road, they decided to go that way. So we'll hear the full story. We'll also hear my story on my land search. In the last episode, I was getting excited again. However, as is often the case, there's a story behind these plots, and the story has developed, so I want to tell you that. I'll spare you till after the interview today, because I have another announcement to make, and that's that I'm going to be speaking at the National Self-Build and Renovation Show on Friday, the 17th of June, 2016. So if you can get along to that, it'd be great to meet you. I'm going to be talking about the Passive House Standard. I did wonder whether I should put together an entirely new talk about why I haven't built a house yet, because I've been going on about this for 4 years, and that may well turn into a presentation at some point. But this is going to be on the Passive House Standard. I've been lucky enough over the last few years to visit, I reckon, in excess of 30 certified passive houses, and I've learned all sorts of things. I've heard the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I think I can give a pretty nice rundown in case that's something you're thinking of doing on your own project. So that's the National Self-Build and Renovation Show, and I would love to see you there, particularly if you're one of our Hub members, because we'll be having a Hub meetup after the session. My session booked in for 1 o'clock, so probably we'll be doing the Hub meetup at around about 2 o'clock. Let's get to our featured interview with Lisa Jackson from Jackson Planning. And this is an interesting one just because it stands as a case study. Someone who knows a few bits and pieces, having worked in the trade for a long time, certainly from the planning angle. And I think you're going to enjoy this as we just look at the whole story behind Fox Barn, which is their passive house build. I started by asking Lisa to tell me a little bit about her background.
I'm a mum. I've got 2 children, a husband. Wedding anniversary, 20 years tomorrow. I took a planning degree, first degree, and then really got into design. So I did a postgraduate in urban design whilst practicing as a planner at local government. And from there moved around a bit, different authorities, and then went to work for a planning consultancy based in Winchester. They moved to Southampton, so I then sort of started working from home, and I got the idea that actually I could run my own business from home, and that's what I've done for the last 7 years.
We're recording this in a house that you have constructed a couple of years ago, and we're going to be talking about that as a case study. Does it make it easier for you being an insider, being in planning, or was this still a massive journey?
No, I think that being inside planning and construction was a huge help. And also my husband, he's also a town planner. He runs the planning department locally, not the area we live in, but the adjacent borough. And his background actually was in construction first. So we made quite a good team. I had become a code assessor. I'd done the exams thinking it was going to be really useful. Shame they ditched it. I never assessed a single home, but it got me into the idea of energy efficiency and that we could build in a different way. And I suppose those skills were hugely helpful for me. I was the sustainability queen and my husband was the construction king.
Let's talk about the plot first of all, because this was an interesting one.
Yeah, we owned half the plot, and actually we had no intention of building a house. We bought the house next door, which was our third doer-upper of our marriage, and our second house in this village, this area. We knew we could do something with the house. We'd heard and we'd seen that planners had refused various attempts to enlarge it, but it was a tiny 2-bed cob cottage, car crashed into a 1970s extension, and we just knew we could do something with it. And so we designed 2 schemes, a traditional brick and flint type extension that was refused planning permission, which we won on appeal, and a much more contemporary revamp of the 1970s with no idea of sustainability or anything. But when we sort of then costed it, we went, we can't afford this. So we were living with a house that was a disaster. the worst house in the village on a really good plot and thought, well, we've got to make some money. And we saw the opportunity with the house we now sit in, and we were going to do a deal with the neighbour who owned the land. And so we approached him. And he said, yes, I've always wanted to build a house in the village. And in fact, he'd built an illegal house on the land behind us now, which he was made to demolish. He thought he could just do it without any consents and get away with it. And so he then sort of pondered on it and came back and he said, well, actually, I'm a bit old. He was 80 at this stage and said, I think it's too late in my life to build it. But if you want to do it, I'll sell you half the plot. So we had half the plot. We had the access point. And the other chap had the frontage. And so we did a 50-50 deal. We drew up an option ourselves based on if we could get planning permission. Our solicitor sort of was horrified when we came to actually do the transaction. He said, I cannot believe that you use this as an option. But we did. We drafted.
Well, slow down a bit here because I don't fully understand this. I get options a little bit. But the first thing that I would think about, if I did this in my area, the person would want a ridiculous amount of money for it. How did you deal with that?
Yeah, well, we knew that. We knew it had to be properly valued. So we paid for a valuation through, an RICS Red Book valuation. So that was based on how much the end property would be worth and how much the planning permission would generate and the cost to build. And so they came up with comparables with what the plot was worth. And then they decided that because we had the access and the other chap had the frontage, it was a 50-50 split. So we basically got
So you were totally fair, in other words.
Absolutely.
And got it.
Our approach was, we were never going to do a deal with this chap if we didn't approach it as a proper business consideration. Okay, we had all the inside knowledge, but we wanted to be fair. And that was important. He was canny. He was old, but he was canny and wise. And he was a businessman himself and would take professional advice. So that's why we were careful in our approach to be completely professional in our dealings.
Let's see if I understand the option part of this.
Yeah.
So what you were saying is you were trying to go through planning before you'd put any money into this at all, having arranged this deal.
Yeah, well, you can make planning application on any piece of land, whether you own it or not. You don't even have to have an option on it. And this is something that people do not realise. You just have to serve notice. So we knew that we were quite, in a legal sense, we were fine to make a planning application. But actually, if we'd made the application and the consent had been granted, suddenly we could have been faced with the difficulty in him not wanting to do a deal. So we said, right, okay, we can do all the planning. That's our thing. We will make the planning application at our risk if you will enter into a formal arrangement, which was just an exchange of letters between us, that should planning permission be granted, the owner gave us an option to purchase the land required to make the site work.
And that's all legally binding, so job done. It's not.
Our solicitor said, actually, it wasn't really legally binding, but it gave us enough comfort to go ahead and, the small risk of making a planning application, which was not a lot because we did it ourselves, we drew our own plans, we filled in our own forms, we did all the survey work and everything ourselves. So therefore, the costs to us were low. I understand, obviously, if you were having to go and buy that professionally, that would be a huge cost and you would probably want your option slightly better.
What would have been the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario would have been perhaps had we managed to get planning consent and he'd said no. Would have been
but
really
no
stuck.
One else could build there, could they?
No, exactly. And I think the huge advantage is we had the only access to the site, which put us in a pretty much a ransom situation. So you could have said, really, we perhaps would have been able to ransom him, but it wasn't his land.
It worked out far better than that, didn't it?
It did, indeed. I don't think we were scared that we would not get planning. That was relatively easy. But again, if that had been refused, we would have appealed.
What did you put in planning for?
Well, we applied for a house that looked like a barn conversion because we're sat on a site that had a single-storey shed. It'd be generous to call it a barn, a shed. So agricultural in style. And we applied, and it's an infill plot, so between a thatched cottage not listed and a small 1.5-storey bungalow. So we had to get something that was relatively low key and what we would describe as contextual in terms of design. And we got consent for a 4-bedroomed house.
Yet this was not the end, was it?
No, not at all. Because having got consent for a 4-bedroomed house and being able to proceed, we knew we had to sell our own existing house in order to build our house that we had now decided that we wanted to build. And during that period, we experienced the really cold winter of 2010 with all the snow. And I was sat at home in the Cobb cottage, freezing, spending money on oil like it was going out of fashion, thinking there has to be a better way. And so that's at that point I started investigating Passivhaus. And I'd picked up the Green Building Store's DVD on the Denby Dale Passivhaus, the masonry construction. And it was probably that we started with, is that actually, well, we could build this house, we could build it as a Passivhaus. And I think at that point, having not sold the house and the market dropped, we went to EcoBuild just to see what was out there. Could we find products? Could we find solutions that worked? And so we went and looked at whole house solutions. And I did quite a lot of research before I went, looking at the sort of Scan House, all those Scandinavian versions, and kind of, oh gosh, they're really expensive. And then found Touchwood Homes, who British firm, timber frame, and thought, actually, this is a better solution, perhaps. And at that point, we thought, okay, we could make this really efficient. Then we got into the idea of a Passivhaus from thinking about it. And there was a good marriage between Touchwood and Passive. They'd done things that were very close to Passive at that point. And so really at that point, we said, okay, let's investigate a Passivhaus. And I was working with some energy consultants who very kindly looked at my plans and went, actually, you don't need to change this very much and you could get to Passive standards. So simple things, we increased the height a little bit in order to get the insulation, which is obviously super thick on a Passivhaus. And we changed the fenestration because we had too much north glazing. We had to get a better balance of south glazing. But really, we were quite close in design terms to the Passive standard anyway, which really helped. And so we then made a Section 73 application, which is an application to vary the plans. So you're not looking really in principle, you're looking at changes. It's a more straightforward consideration of a planning application. And they do issue a new consent, but effectively it's a more lightweight consideration of the issues, having got the house and the new dwelling agreed in principle.
Let's talk about that planning for a second. Is this very common or would you be worried about anything?
Developers use it a lot as a trick, but most people think that once they've got planning permission, that's what they need to build. And the answer is no. Go back and revisit if you need to revisit. So few people use it, and actually it's a really powerful tool to go and, if you like, improve, because you don't, in a design sense, you don't stop when you get to the point where you've got planning permission. You're thinking, can I make it better? What can I do? And you shouldn't really be hamstrung by a consent if you feel, actually, I really need to change it. There are small things you can do called non-material amendments, which the councils are allowed to consider. But an awful lot of the bigger changes that you'd want to make would need an additional planning consent. It's the time delay more than anything that I think people are scared of. And they seem to think they're going to lose their consent. Well, they won't, because the consent they have already is established.
Sometimes when you're looking for properties as well on websites, and it does feel a bit weird that you're going to buy a house that's already been designed on this land. So I don't know whether you have anything to say on that.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, if someone has in principle got a dwelling, a consent for a dwelling, there is nothing to stop someone revisiting that. And you may not want to live with someone else's, and probably don't want to live with someone else's design. So people really shouldn't be sort of pigeonholed into thinking, well, I've got to implement that. That's what's got planning permission. You know, there's every opportunity, if it stays within the sort of constraints and doesn't do any harm, because planning's in the public interest, you know, it's to protect the harm of the adjacent dwellings or the area, the character of an area. It's not there to say you have particular interiors or even some of the external features could change.
When you submitted the plans, were you in any way taking into account knowing this area and this region and what they like? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really key. I mean, my philosophy to clients is don't make a planning application for what you want. You have to make a planning application for what you'll get consent for. Make it policy compliant, look at all the guidance. And there's a lot of guidance in conservation area appraisals and village design statements and character studies. You need to hit those targets. If they outlaw particular styles, you have to pay regard to that. And so if you wanted an easy route through planning, look at what's got consent locally, what works, and look at guidance. And, for us, it was easy. And things like scale are the key things, scale and contextual design. So we used a tile that was local in the villages. We looked at the height very carefully and drew street sections to show that it wasn't dominant on either of the dwellings either side. It's not just thinking about your house and what you want to achieve. It's thinking about how it fits in its context. And so often architects and, I dare say, self-builders lose that. And you'll end up wanting desperately to build the house that you want and not paying any regard to its context. And that more often than not is the reason it fails.
Before I hit record on this interview, you gave me an interesting tip. I don't know whether I'm stealing your secrets here about submitting some drawings that have been done with pencil.
Well,
have I phrased? I've probably
no.
No.
It's about an approach, isn't it? And I was a planning officer. And when I used to get a new file, I was really excited. And you'd open the plans and your heart would sink so often. Things were badly drawn, bad CAD. And it just, where was the love? Where was the feel of it? I personally love hand-drawn designs. I know it's old-fashioned, but actually it gives a nice feel for it. And I do think that when you present your drawings, think really carefully about how they look. What will that planning officer think when they open the plans? Will they go, oh goodness? Because so often CAD does not represent how the building will look. There's no light and shade. There's no feeling of the materials, etc. So presentation, to my mind, is everything in winning over that hearts and mind of that planning officer, because that's what you've got to do. And they've got to love it like you do.
Coming back to that house, and you made it sound almost very easy to convert your original barn-style idea into a passive house. Was there much more to it than that? Or was it just a case of upping the insulation, making sure good air tightness, blinds, windows you've talked about?
Yeah, we had to do all of that. But we also did the science, and we have the PHPP verification, because I decided from a business point of view that it was important that we got certified. And it's a classic thing. I say to people, they go, well, why do you bother? It costs more money. And I said, well, a couple of things. It's a business model. I wanted to show other clients, and I have persuaded clients that they should go for certification. Secondly, you try and sell a house without radiators. How are you going to do it? You've got to think of resale. And so if you have the paperwork, if you have the science, if you have that great big Excel spreadsheet, you can demonstrate to people that actually, yes, it does work, it will work, and it does what it says on the tin. Clearly, living here is a different thing. You can tell people what it's like. But if people want certification because they would be buying something really unconventional.
The build itself, you said you had to sell, or maybe that was just at that point in time to be able to start this. Was that what happened? And if so, where did you go?
Right. We decided to stay close to the site, which I have to say, top tip for any self-builder, be as close to the site as possible. And we rented a little cottage down the road. We did think about the mobile home on site for all of 5 minutes, but I'm running my own business and I just went, no, I can't do that. I really can't do that. And I take my hat off to those brave people who do live in a mobile home on site. We rented a house down the road on a short term, and that worked out really well. Yes, because we did have to finance it through basically the equity we had in our old home, and towards the end with extra borrowing.
Maybe we'll get to that in a moment. What's the construction type, and was that a fairly easy process? You mentioned Touchwood.
We have a simple light and tight, as it's called, timber frame, pre-cut off-site and insulated with warm cell, which is the recycled paper. A fantastic construction technique, very easy, very straightforward. Touchwood were good to work with, and their marriage with on the passive front. So they introduced us to Dr. Roderick Williams, who was fabulous, who did our PHPP work. And yeah, they know what they're doing. They know about air tightness. Slightly unusual in terms of the passive world because it's externally airtight and externally wrapped. We have no problems with that whatsoever. There are those in the industry who question that, but it works. And there's no doubt that it works.
What about the construction process itself? Anything that you feel you should mention about that time?
It's hard work, and it's not for the faint-hearted, I think. There are a lot of competing things all the time with making decisions. And the thing that we found, we assembled our own local team of tradesmen, and we were very lucky. Every single one was great. We knew them all before because we'd done a lot of houses up and through recommendations. And so really good team. But there are certain things that just simply fall between skills. And you have to do that if there's no one else to do it. So we did find ourselves an awful lot of the time filling in the gaps that other trades don't do.
What do you mean?
There were odd bits. Insulating around the windows, for example, was not something that was done by the warm cell because it was a particular type of insulation. It had to be done differently. So we had to do that.
This made me think, because we recently created a module in the hub on sweat equity, which is, it's a tough line to tread, because I hope to do as little as possible because I'm a bit of a disaster when it comes to DIY. However, there are pretty nice savings, and obviously towards the end the budget was tight. Yeah,
absolutely. And the sweat equity, we did lots of that. My husband is particularly helpful and handy and fabulous at DIY. And so he wasn't afraid of doing any of those tasks. And I mean, even, for example, digging a trench to put a cable in, because all of a sudden it was, well, we need that's coming on Monday and there isn't a digger on site. So he came out in the rain and did it himself.
That's proper sweat equity.
Yeah, proper sweat equity. Things like painting and decorating, we did some of it, but, frankly, it was a huge task.
And the equation is there that if you can be earning more money somewhere else, where are you better placed?
We had a bit of an odd one, because my husband, right during the construction, got cancer and had an operation. And it sounds hideous, but actually it's the best thing that ever happened. I mean, that really does sound bad, but he was a lucky one. He caught it early. It was a kidney, and they had to remove a kidney. He didn't have to have any radiotherapy or anything, but he had to spend quite a long time recovering. And so he took on project management, which was brilliant, because I was trying to run the business and earn money. And actually, the amount of time you need on project management is much more than we had anticipated. So his recovery, which I think helped him recover and helped me just keep going, was to come on site and sort of sit quietly, direct things in his recovery phase, which worked really well. And bizarre and bonkers, and not the thing you want to happen during a build. But actually, it was probably one of those fortuitous things that he had additional time.
Well, you hear of all sorts of things, don't you? The family arriving as you start to self-build, all it's one thing or another. At least you've got out through the other side. You also mentioned money a while back. Could you see this coming, and how easy was it to get more money when you got to that stage?
No, it wasn't that easy. I don't know if you remember the fiscal cliff that the Americans had. It was that winter that when we were building, 2011, I think it must have been. And we had our own fiscal cliff, because we kind of looked at what was left in the bank and the advances of the mortgage, and looked at what still needed to be done and who was on site. And there was a huge gap. There was a gap of £60,000. We borrowed some of it from mum-in-law. Sadly, she's now died. But that helped. That was one thing. And then we managed to extend the mortgage. But trying to extend a mortgage on a self-build, the ridiculous thing, the Halifax man came out. When he initially came out, he said, okay, what sort of glazing are you having? Double or single? I went triple. He said, oh, well, I'll tick both boxes then. Honestly, they just haven't got a clue about what self-build is, how it works as a product, how money's advanced, how you need the money before you hit the stages. It's a nightmare. We were lucky because there was a lot of equity just in the plot itself. And so it was never that tricky. But it's just that moment of, I need the money now. I haven't got it. I've got to apply. I've got to go through the mortgage broker. We had a fantastic mortgage broker, and he was a huge help. So it's that kind of thing that makes a difference.
How long have you been in the house now?
We've been in 3 years.
And what's it been like?
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, when we moved in, because we were short, it was still a building site. And I have said to everybody, this is a building site that slowly is becoming a home, and it takes time. And a home isn't just about a building, it's about memories, it's about events, it's about experiences. And so, we've begun to have the birthday parties and the Christmases and all those things that make it a home. And it's the memories that the children will build up of it as a home. And, we still haven't got the curtains in the front room because, frankly, they were not a priority. And, slowly, you add to it to make it homely. And the building site bit went when we attacked the garden 2 years ago and did a sort of major scheme of landscaping. And making the garden for me also makes it more of a home.
Yeah, I've seen a few houses that have come short towards the end, and it is unfortunate that it's the landscaping that suffers. And I think you're right. Would you have any advice for someone coming fresh in, wanting to build their own energy efficient home?
Take good professional advice. If you're struggling with the planning system, which you often will, find a good local consultant, and the Royal Town Planning Institute have a good list of local consultants. Don't necessarily go for the big firms. I would small one-man bands, of which there are a lot of, like me, who can advise. Look at who's managed to get planning permissions in your area. It's not difficult to do. Just go on the planning portal and look at the agents. That's one thing I'd say. The other things, we should have had a lighting designer because we slightly overspecified on lighting. And that's one of those luxuries that, with hindsight, I would love to have had. I think you have to be brave, and you really, really have to be prepared to put in the work because it's hard. No doubt about it. And it's funny, my husband says that sometimes he can even watch grand designs and have palpitations of he remembering that thing of running out of money and thinking, oh dear, where's the... every time on grand designs, it's always they run out of money. That's the nature of self-build. I think it's the way the finance is structured. And, he says he still finds it hard to watch that. And he reckoned he took a couple of years to recover, really, from the whole process. But he is talking about the next one.
Love it. Lisa, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Head online to take a look at the show notes for this one, houseplanninghelp.com/130. You can review the key points. We've also got photos through construction to the completed project. And of course, maybe Lisa's in your area and you want help with your planning. Lisa at Jackson Planning will link across to her, all in the show notes today, houseplanninghelp.com/130. So I said at the beginning of this podcast that I'd give you my updated land story. Last time I was telling you how I found this really nice plot, good value, all of these bonuses. It was flat, south facing, so the orientation there. However, what we thought was one piece of land actually turned out to be two. And I remember at the time, I just had this uncomfortable feeling. We tried to clarify this as well, because my wife had done a little bit of digging online and had found this document. I thought, this doesn't match up with what's being advertised online. And it all looked good in the picture. And as I mentioned, the price of this and the fact that it was a nice flat piece of land, good orientation, all of these bonuses, yet something wasn't right. So that's ultimately led to us thinking, okay, here's another one. Back down the snake in the game of snakes and ladders. Will we ever get up to the top? Very, very frustrating. Now, my call to action today, slightly different to normal, because I was thinking, instead of a hub update, I'm sure you know all about the hub, and we'll be talking about this for a good long time into the future. I just ask you that if you have been listening to the podcast and you've got value from it, maybe you could just do me one small favour and pass on that message to someone else. It doesn't have to be immediately. Maybe you'll come across someone who you think, hold on, this might be useful to you. Just pass on that link or that name onto them, House Planning Help, and then that would be much appreciated. Okay, I'm finishing up then. Thank you once again for listening. Always a pleasure to have you here. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.